spotlight you.
Okay.
Do you want to share screen right from the start, or are you gonna start later with share screening?
Yeah, I think I can start just later.
Okay, then we'll see them. But you should be ready to set.
Okay. Well, thank you all for being here, for the opportunity to present some of my views. So hopefully it's going to be a good time for studying together. Just a quick couple of things that I wanted to say just before we start. I'd like to make clear that it was never my intention to create any contention or division. Over the time and subject of the Sunday law. I would also like to clarify that I have given been the opportunity to present my studies. They have been presented in Spanish and Portuguese. So hopefully now it's going to be a great opportunity for the rest of you to know a little bit about it. Now coming to our study. Why is Acts 27 so important for the subject of the Sunday law? It's good to remember that this story began when Elder Tess was inspired She was inspired to look for the word midnight all through the Bible. I assumed she arrived to many different places. But specifically Acts 27 called her attention. And we know that it's basically where our midnight cry started. That's why I would like to suggest that Acts 27, it's the midnight cry in a nutshell. And verse 27 being the midnight cry itself. But the midnight cry for the sheep and not for any of the groups of people. It is also verse 27 that speaks specifically about the timing of the Sunday law. So it is my belief that if we're to know about the timing and the subject of the Sunday law, our first point of reference should be Acts 27. Now let's lay the foundations for the waymarks of Acts 27. I know that we all know about Acts 27, but I think there's still not enough clarity about what are the waymarks of this line. So let's look at the waymarks of Acts 27. We know that it is divided in two ships. and what we know about the ship of Adramyttium. And we're gonna draw its waymarks over here. It's basically 4 waymarks. It would be the only line that we have that it's composed of 4 waymarks and not 5. We sometimes call this line the 5th line. So we start with Caesarea, Sidon, Cyprus, and Myra and Lycia. And they respectively correspond to the following years, which is 1989, the time of the end. Then we have the year 2001, 2021, and this is where we have to find out what it is. So now we have the line of Alexandria. I mean, the ship of Alexandria. And it will be the same waymarks from the half onward. So I'm gonna just draw them here. And we know, actually, I wanna make a question. Do we know how we decide what are waymarks? I was trying to understand how their test decided what is a waymark for the ship. And so I realized that there's 2 types of events that happen to the ship. Either the ship stops, I'm going to use this symbol, or the ship experiences an event with wind. So we will see that the ship stops in these 4 waymarks. And now we're going to fill out what is before that corresponds to another dispensation. We know the ship came from Alexandria. The waymark of Myra and Lycia was transferred to 1844. Then we have Cnidus, Laceia. We have the Euroclydon. Well, I'm going to call this the Midnight Cry. And this is Shipwreck. So if we read the story carefully, we know that the ship stopped at Alexandria. I mean, it's the beginning. It also stopped in Myra and Lycia. But it never stopped in Cnidus. So it was actually, the ship was taken off course, as Elder Tess would put it. It went off course. For Adramyttian, all of these places were stops. So now I would like to suggest that we have basically a chiasm over here. It just allows us to see that it's methodologically correct. So having decided what are the waymarks of Acts 27, I would like to suggest that the fifth line is basically the following. It is composed by something that we already know, which is Boston, Concord, Exeter. We can call this the shut door, but it's basically Boston as well. So now I would suggest that we have our Bibles open. We're going to be going back and forth in Acts 27. Verse 27 of Acts 27 says, but when the 14th night, but when the 14th night was come, as we were driven up and down in Adria about midnight, the shipmen deemed that they drew near some country. In this verse, Elder Tess found all the elements that make this point the midnight cry. Elements such as the 14th night, the very word midnight, and we can assume that the sailors, they cried land when they spotted it. So they never said it, but we know that that's what sailors do. I would like to suggest that verse 28, it's part of the midnight cry. Verse 28 says, and sounded and found it 20 fathoms. And when they had gone a little further, they sounded again and found it 15 fathoms. In this verse, we find another important element of an Exeter waymark. Which is the element of time. The sailors aren't really calculating time. They are in fact calculating distance, or more precisely, depth. But in summary, we can say that in the literal, they calculated distance. And in the spiritual, they calculated time. So we have the 20 fathoms. which are equal to 1440 inches. And then later they sounded again and found it to be 1080. Sorry, they found it to be 15 fathoms, which is 1080. So we know Elder Tess took these two numbers, added them up, and it came to 2520. I'm not going to be talking about other waymarks prior to 2021. But I want to say that Elder Tess, up until this verse, she gave us all that she was able to interpret about the spiritual. If we look, for example, at the Euroclydon, we know that it was 9/11. And I could go on with the other waymarks, going backwards. But about 2021, we don't really have yet the fulfillment of this verse. So the following, what I'm going to do, was actually shared to me by a friend. Back in 2020, Aaron Sen shared with me what I'm going to say. He probably explained it in different words back then. But the idea is the same. And I'm going to try to defend that approach. So we have 20 fathoms and 15 fathoms. We have to take, I would suggest that we would consider this symbolically. Before we do that, let's talk about verse 29 quickly. I would like to suggest that verse 29 belongs to also 2021. So let's read verse 29. It says, "Then fearing lest we should have fallen upon the rocks, they cast 4 anchors out of the stern and wished for the day." I wanted to read an Ellen White quote, 2 Ellen White quotes, but just for time, we're going to skip them. But be mindful that Ellen White, she includes verse 27, 28, and 29 to only one paragraph. So that's why I say 27, 28, and 29 are all the same waymark. So coming back to the fathoms, if we consider symbolically that the sheep sounded the first time and it was 20 fathoms, and then 15, it is giving us a rate of how far was the island. And the rate is the measurement. So how closer they got to the island from the first measurement to the second? So we can obviously see that it was 5 fathoms. So I would like to suggest that symbolically, we can do the following. 2021 would be the first sounding, which is 20 fathoms. And 0 fathoms would be the island, which is a shipwreck. Just gonna call it Sunday law. So 15 fathoms would be the year 22. Then the year 23 would be 10 fathoms. Then the year 24 would be 5 fathoms. And then obviously 0, just the island. So this here is just a, let's call it a theory. So we will continue. Let's make a quick jump from verse 29 to 41. In verse 29, they dropped 4 anchors. If you look at the line, this is where I told you the waymarks are decided whether they stopped or they experienced something with the wind. Not they, I should have said the ship. So that's why I know 29 is still 2021. So let's read verse 29. And then we go to 41. 29 says, then fearing lest we should have fallen upon the rocks, they cast 4 anchors out of their stern and wished for the day. Verse 41 says, and falling, no, not 41, I should have read 40. So I'm just going to read it from here. And when they had taken up the anchors, they committed themselves into the sea and loosed the rudder bands and hoisted up the mainsail to the wind and made toward shore. You can go read this in your own time. But the same anchors that were dropped in verse 29 are then taken up in 41. So let's try to think about the spiritual application of this. What happened to the United States institution and allow me to quickly clarify. The ship represents two institutions, we know that. But we're going to be dealing with the application for the US institution. Not the SDA. What happened in the year 2021 that was evident for the institution they were near the end? And according to verse 29, they almost crashed to the rocks. We all know how the story of Acts 27 goes. The island is the point in the journey where the ship ends. It ends in shipwreck. This shipwreck marks the end of the institution of the USA as we know it. It also marks the end of the Sixth Kingdom. We also say that it marks the end of the democracy, of the American democracy. Yet shipwreck doesn't happen until verse 41. So as we read 40, they take up those anchors that were holding the ship and 41 says, and falling into a place where two seas met, they ran the ship aground, which means they crashed it to the island. And the forepart stuck fast and remained unmovable, but the hinder part was broken with the violence of the waves. I find it interesting that at the beginning of this movement, the Sunday law was verse 41. Of course, I'm referring to Daniel 11:41. But now towards the end, it's Acts 27:41 that marks the Sunday law again. But let's go back to 29. I want to suggest that they almost, or they could have crashed to the rocks in 29. So I would like to argue that Acts 27 is saying that in 2021, the American institution almost lost their democracy. So that shipwreck could have happened in 2021. They delayed shipwreck for a while with the anchors. We already read that it happens it only happens in 41. This was perfectly fulfilled by the events of January 6th and 7th of 2021. That day, the world saw how an angry mob breached the United States Capitol. Successfully interrupting the democratic process. Because that day, Joe Biden's electoral votes were being certified. Let's make a quick parenthesis about the importance of January 6th in the American Constitution and law. According to the law, every January 6th after an election is the day of certification. Congress can change the date if January 6th falls a Sunday or because of other reason. But that day, the certification, it's the last step. That if it doesn't happen, America would not have a president. I would like to go into the details, but we don't have time. So far, I have provided a possible conclusion of what happened to the ship in 2021. Sorry, I keep missing the symbols. What happens to the ship in verses 27 to 29? It is the year that the American democracy, they were sure they were near the end. But they dropped anchors to avoid the rocks. And basically, the American democracy was able to survive for 4 more years. Now, let's talk about the element of time. We have an element of time in 2021. What could be then the element of time in 2021? We need to be consistent. And this line is not talking about us. We're surely included. We can have visibility about events regarding us. But this story is about the ship, not the people. I would like to suggest that the element of time has to be found related to the institution and not us. The institution doesn't have the Bible, prophetic numbers, prophetic lines. How then can the institution calculate time? There's an interview made to Hillary Clinton about 2 years ago. And she was asked, what could happen if Trump wins again? She said, it would be the end of our democracy. This is not her personal view only. Virtually everyone in the Democratic Party think likewise. As well as some Republicans. Take Venezuela, for example, which is my home country. In 1992, Hugo Chavez orchestrated a coup. 1992. It's Hugo Chavez. The coup failed. He spent time in Yale. When he got out, he ran for president in the election of 1998. Some people warned that he would bring about a dictatorship. He finally won the election with his populist message. And guess what? We did lose our democracy. That by now would have been one of the oldest democracies of South America. The lesson is simple. If someone who tried to end democracy once and later becomes president, in our case, Donald Trump, he would end democracy. My suggestion is that the institution calculated time. They calculated time in 2021 in the sense that they knew that if Trump became president again, it would be the end of their democracy. In other words, shipwreck. No other candidate could fulfill this requirement. I'd like to argue that the calculation of time is strictly tied to Donald Trump. When the ship almost crashed with the rocks in verse 28, It represents Donald Trump attempting to remain in power by force. Therefore, the institution knows that if he returns, it would be the end. No other candidate can fit this description. Acts 27 predicts the return of Trump to the White House. So the calculation of time takes place in 21. And I'm arguing that the calculation is when Trump could return. Without being specific, Trump returns in January of 2025. So far I have provided 2 witnesses for the year 2025. We have the fathoms, and we have the element of time. That I just explained. Now let's look at a third witness for the Sunday law or shipwreck to be 2025. Let's read Acts 27:29. Just again. Then, fearing lest we should have fallen upon the rocks, they cast 4 anchors out of the stern and wished for the day. I'm in quote 9 for translators. And we're going to read down what Ellen White has to say about this verse. This is in the book Life of Paul. They were now threatened by a new danger of having their ship driven upon the rock-bound coast. They immediately cast out 4 anchors, which was the only thing that could be done. All through the remaining hours of that day, they waited, knowing that any moment might be their last. The leak was constantly increasing, and the ship might sink at any time, even if the anchors held. So if we can imagine the ship is this way, Mark. They could have fallen upon the rocks, but they took a last-minute resource. And they dropped 4 anchors. So this is the 4 anchors. We now need to think, what is it that happens to the ship in 2021? Sorry, to the institution in 2021? That could represent the institution almost losing their democracy, but they managed to do something to avoid it or to delay this end of their democracy. I want to emphasize something. Prophecy is saying that this takes place in 2021, not in 2020. If our Weimar was 2020, I would have no issues to say that these anchors that were dropped were just the election. Because essentially Trump was taking this country to shipwreck. But in 2020, he lost the election and Democrats took power again. We could say this election really prevented the United States from losing their democracy. But we need to be consistent because the parable is saying that it's 2021, not 2020. That's why the rocks where the ship almost crashed onto, it's, as I suggested, the event of January 6th. But they didn't crash to the rocks. They dropped the anchors to avoid that. Well, if we look at the events of the next day, which is the 7th of January, Congress was able to come back to the chamber and they finally certified Joe Biden and Kamala Harris as president and vice president. So I would say that the anchors that were dropped was the certification. Now, let's look at for how long are these anchors going to hold the ship? In the literal, we already read it up until verse 40. But if we are saying that these anchors were dropped in the year 2021, and as I'm suggesting, it is the anchors, it is the certification of Joe Biden. What then could mean that in verse 40 it says, and then they took up the anchors and went to the shore? It means these anchors or this president that was certified at some point has to go out. So I would say that it's January of 2025. So this was my third witness for shipwreck being 2025. Give me a second. Yeah, for time, we won't be able to talk about other prophetic lines. Where a democratic presidency was prophesied to return in 2021. I will refer you to go back and study the Third Diadochi War. As Elder Tess presented it in the International Camp Meeting of 2019. In that line, we have a clear symbol that Antigonus comes back in 2021. In summary, the primary application of these anchors is that they are a democratic presidency. This you can understand only using the structure. Yet, God gives us more evidence. I'm going to be reading from number 10, quote number 10. I looked in the Strong Concordance for the word anchor. And it comes from the word, I'm just going to put the number, G45. That essentially means crooked. Do you have it? It says from the same as G43. Okay. So it says that it means crooked, and it comes from the word G43. That basically means bend. When it says akos, a bend, ache, an arm, bend. Perfect. So I went on to look for the word Biden. I will later share all of my notes so everyone can read it by their own, in their own time. But for time, I will go directly to the point. Biden comes from a very old word that I don't even know how to pronounce, beg. I looked for this word beg in Wikipedia. And it basically means bend. It's right there, it says bend. So this study is not about name meanings. The story is about a structure that tells you that the ship was about to crash in 2021. but the institution delayed its fall with a democratic presidency. Then the meaning of anchors being the same as Biden is just a nice confirmation. Bend. Good. So now we enter into the realm of unfulfilled prophecy. From now on, we're going to be talking about Acts 27:30. Actually, 30 to 32. I will read it. And as the shipmen were about to flee out of the ship, when they had let down the boat into the sea, under color, as though they would have cast anchors out of the foreship, Paul said to the centurion and to the soldiers, "Except these abide in the ship, ye cannot be saved." The soldiers cut off the ropes of the boat and let her fall off. Oh, sorry, I read 30 to 32, which is quote 13. 3 verses. I was okay. I stopped at 32. Okay. So I was really puzzled by verse 30. It took me a long time to understand what was happening. But to summarize it, we're going to read a quote from Acts of the Apostles. It's quote 16 for translators. And it says, "At break of day, the outlines of the stormy coast were dimly visible, but no familiar landmark could be seen. So gloomy was the outlook that the heathen sailors, losing all courage, were about to flee out of the ship, and feigning to make preparations for casting anchors out of the foreship, they had already let down the lifeboat, when Paul, perceiving their base design, said to the centurion and the soldiers, 'Except this abide in the ship, ye cannot be saved.' The soldiers immediately cut off the ropes of the boat and let her fall off into the sea." So we now have to decide whether verse 30 it's part of the year 2021 or later. I would like us to pay attention to some details. If we read the end of verse 29, after they cast the 4 anchors, it says, and wished for the day. So what is the day? So if this is where they cast the 4 anchors, and it's from this point on that they're going to wish for the day, the day is simply the period of waiting. By the way, day here means daylight. They're waiting for light. So let's pay attention to the first line of the quote we just read. She says, at break of day, the outlines of the stormy coast were dimly visible. So she knows that verse 30 didn't take place right after the anchors. The sailors, they waited for the day. But a very specific period of the day. And then White calls it the break of day. This is the moment when they're trying to flee. And let's understand flee with its proper context. Flee means that everyone dies. Let's read the next quote, 17. They're very similar. The one was Acts of the Apostles, and this is Life of Paul. At last, through rain and tempest, the great light fell upon their haggard and ghastly faces. The outlines of the stormy coast could be dimly seen. This part is all the same. You can read till there. And somewhere around the half of the paragraph, it says, pretending that they could do something. You find it? That they could do something to secure the safety of the ship. They're lying. In Acts 27, that thing is that they pretended to drop other anchors. Sorry, I made a mistake. I put day here and this is night. This is the time that they waited. Then from verse 30 onward, it would be the day that they were waiting for. So a graphical idea of what is going on is the following. If this is the ship These are the 4 anchors that are dropped. And this is where the shipmen were. They did that in 29. But Ellen White says that at break of day, at the very beginning of the day, they went to the front of the ship. And they never say how many anchors are in the front of the ship. The Bible doesn't say. But parabolically, we know that if one side has 4, the other side has 4, just by parabol teaching. So I would say that the front of the ship has also 4 anchors. But what the parable wants to emphasize, this is my suggestion, is that those 4 anchors of the front, they're never dropped, never cast. But before we deal with that, let's deal with the sailors. Something incredible happened to the sailors. They have been, up until this point, the bravest sailors of all time. For you that have read Life of Paul, Ellen White says that this was a good ship. I want to suggest that we cannot separate the ship from the shipmen, the sailors. That's why Ellen White says in Acts of the Apostles, the phrase is losing all courage. It means that they were courageous sailors, but they lost all courage. This parable do not differentiate between Democrats and Republicans. This parable just says that from 1798 till this point, these people are courageous sailors. But something happened to the sailors that night that they waited for the day. They wished for the day. I know we have other lines that already shows us how Republicans are being so bad from some years back. It's been decades of history where Republicans are really trying to, take this country to a wrong place. But not this parable. They're probably not the wisest sailors, but they're certainly courageous. But in this period, they lost all courage. Later, we will talk about who the sailors represent. I already provided a hint. The sailors are the ones who drop the anchors. Okay. Give me a second. Now we need to decide, now that I have at least separated the time from verse 29 to 30, because 29 is the period that they cast the anchors and waited for the day. Whatever that day means. We now need to know what the phrase cast anchors mean. Because this phrase is going to be used both in 29 and 30. So I want to suggest that it means something specifically. If we let the parable to guide us, and if you, sorry, I think I'm without battery in this phone, in this headphone. I'm just gonna change quickly. Sorry. I have this one over here.
Also, as a reminder, Pedro, you have 12 minutes left.
12, what do you say? Sorry.
You have 12 minutes left.
Perfect. Okay, I will continue. We'll stop in 10 minutes. So let's look at the phrase cast anchors. What I suggested is that in verse 29, the casting of the anchors, is the certification. It is what they do right after they could have crashed to the rocks. Therefore, this has to be certification of it as well. But there's a difference. Verse 29 says, they cast 4 anchors out of the stern. But verse 30 says that they pretended to cast anchors. They never cast those anchors. They cast something different instead. That is called the lifeboat, the boat. Yeah. Perfect. So I want to suggest that verse 30, it's talking about another certification. And I have already suggested that certification of, it has to be a certification of a democratic president. First time around, it was Biden. The second time, it's going to be Kamala. So now we will read a quote. It is quote number 23. I actually repeated this quote. It's 22 as well. Sorry about that. It's the same. This is going to be about the name Kamala. A friend of mine sent me this quote. It is from a book that Kamala Harris wrote in 2018. And she says, "My first name is pronounced Kamala, like the punctuation mark. It means lotus flower, which is a symbol of significance in Indian culture. A lotus flower grows underwater, its flowers rising above the surface, while its roots are planted firmly in the river bottom." So I would like to suggest that the picture of a lotus flower and also the emphasis that Kamala is given to the meaning she doesn't really focus on, the flower that is above the surface. She just supposed that with, and she says, while its roots are planted firmly in the river bottom. So I would like to suggest that this is also a symbology for anchor. Meaning that the first anchors were Biden certification, and the second set of anchors are Kamala's. Yet, she wouldn't be certified because those anchors were never dropped. So I think it's a good point to stop here. I'm not sure if we're praying after or we can just stop. Just waiting for instructions.
If you close with prayer, Pedro.
Oh, okay. Let's have a quick prayer. Thank you, dear God, for the opportunity for studying. Please continue blessing us with your light. May we arrive together to the conclusion that you want us to arrive. May those not be mine, but yours. In the name of Jesus, amen.
Before we close, Pedro.
Yes.
You have 5 minutes left. Could you give a quick 5-minute summary of what you've taught so far, the key points for us, so that we can prepare for the second study that you're going to do?
Yeah, thank you for that.
I know you've already prayed, but if you could just review for us the main highlights of what you want us to understand.
Perfect. I will do. So, do you want to say that, Shime? What I want us to take from this first study is that we have the ship representing the US institution going towards its shipwreck. But before shipwreck will happen, they're first going to be, their first will almost suffer shipwreck before the actual island. Which is 2021. They cast anchors. Essentially stopping the ship from crashing. I'm suggesting that it is a prophecy about a democratic presidency return. A democratic president that would last only 4 years. That would then finally go to shipwreck. And that shipwreck is represented by the return of Trump. I have suggested that there's at least 3 witnesses for pointing the shipwreck for placing the shipwreck in 2025. Something about 2021 make the institution calculate how far is the end. Those are the events of January 2021. The agitation of the Sunday law. And that is the element of time. I also wanted to see, wanted all of us to see that the Bible is providing us a rate of, or basically a velocity of the ship. Being represented by 5 fathoms. I just realized that I missed a very important point. I didn't say that 5 fathoms are 360 inches. The number 360, we're going to use it as a symbol for a year. Therefore, the ship is approaching the island 5 fathoms per measurement. And the calculation takes us to 2025. And just to finalize, I wanted us to see that those anchors represent, the first anchors represent Biden, and the second ones represent Kamala. We're going to expand on verse 30 and what those Kamala anchors mean. Thank you.